Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Bulletin. I am going back in time a little bit with this particular piece of content, back to the time when I used to rant against some of the institutions that I have always resented. Sometimes that's NASA, but not always. NASA has accomplished some amazing things in its history, and I think it's sometimes unfair to judge them in the way that they sometimes get judged, especially by the popular mainstream media. That is an organization that I love to rant against all the time. Mainstream media is only interested in what impacts their bottom line. They also always have some sort of agenda, and the last few weeks has been no exception. Really, when it comes down to it, the last few days, ever since we had the failure of the Intuitive Machines moon landing and also the failure of Starship Flight 8. And all that being the case, the mainstream media hasn't talked at all about the enormous success that NASA experienced, or to be more specific, an organization called Firefly, a private company that became the first private company in history, not just in the United States, anywhere in the world, to successfully land on the moon without any flaws, without any, they landed, but none of those sorts of conditional details. Instead, they landed successfully on the moon, full stop, and ever since then, they've been carrying out some very useful science that will help pave the way for mankind's return to the moon, for human missions to the moon, including a permanent presence on the lunar surface and also in lunar orbit. That's what these missions are all about, and this last mission from Firefly definitely took a big step forward and also gave NASA a good idea as to what works and what doesn't work. And sure, there have been many comparisons that have been made lately as to how successful NASA was in the 60s versus these recent failures and how NASA has lost its edge, etc., etc. But what the media is not taking into account, and really what they're getting the general public believing, is that what's happening today is somehow unique, that these sorts of things didn't happen before, that NASA was flawless in its lunar mission record in the past. Actually, there's some details about the Apollo missions, or rather the Surveyor missions that came before it, that I didn't know anything about. Number one, not all of them were successful. And number two, they cost an insane amount of money in today's dollars. As a matter of fact, if NASA had to spend that kind of money on robotic to the missions today, these missions simply wouldn't happen because Congress wouldn't give them the money. So that being the case, has all of this really been that unsuccessful? And also, what sort of contribution has SpaceX made to all of this? Well, let me tell you. The news is mostly positive, and it gets me very angry that the media is not acknowledging it.
We are now well into the countdown at approximately 3 minutes before liftoff. All systems are reported in excellent condition at this time.
Pressurization. Go, Atlas.
Go, Centaur.
Atlas autopilot. Go. Centaur autopilot.
Go.
Launch director. Go. All recorders fast. Engine start. And it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And sorry for cutting off this documentary's audio, but before I get slammed with a music copyright strike, I think it's time for us to talk about what you're actually watching, which is the launch of Surveyor 1 on May 30th, 1966. And by the way, this mission landed on the moon on June 2nd of 1966, back in the day when you could get an unmanned probe out to the moon in only 3 days. And if the rocket looked a little familiar, well, it should have, because it was an Atlas Centaur rocket, not built by United Launch Alliance, because wasn't called United Launch Alliance in those days, but it's a rocket that really hasn't changed that dramatically up to the present day. Really, Vulcan Centaur is the most significant evolution that this rocket has gone through since the 1960s, and a rocket with this much thrust and also an expendable rocket that doesn't shut off the booster engines early in the flight so that the booster can return to the landing site or to a landing barge further downrange. Well, if you can make use of every drop of fuel and keep those engines running until the vehicle is already in low Earth orbit, that unmanned probe is going to arrive at the moon a lot more rapidly than the ones that we launch today, at least most of the time. Each of the NASA Surveyor spacecraft, these robotic spacecraft that were the precursors to the Apollo missions, weighed a metric ton at launch, were 3.3 meters high, and had a 4.5 meter diameter. That's an important detail that I want you to keep tucked away until we talk about it a little bit later. The tripod structure of aluminum tubing provided mounting surfaces for scientific and engineering equipment. Onboard equipment consisted of a 3-meter square solar panel that provided approximately an 85-watt output, a main battery, and a 24-volt non-rechargeable battery that together yielded a 4,090-watt total output, a planar array antenna, 2 omnidirectional antennas, and a radar altimeter. They used radar altimeters instead of LiDAR in those days because LiDAR didn't really exist in the 1960s. And the vehicle carried out a soft landing on the moon 5 times. Surveyor 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7 all successfully landed on the moon. However, Surveyor 2 and Surveyor 4 failed. So we actually have a better record for Surveyor already with the first 7 launches than the NASA CLPS mission has had thus far, because we've had the Astrobotic mission as a complete failure and the IM-2 mission as mostly a failure. IM-1 being largely successful even though it toppled over. Most of the experiments could be carried out anyway, and only the Firefly Blue Ghost being an unqualified success. So it sounds like Surveyor was far more successful and a better program, indicating that NASA had the right stuff in the 60s and not today. But there's an important difference to keep in mind. The Surveyor program, in adjusted dollars, cost the American taxpayer $4.2 billion. Once again, that's in today's money. So divide that by 7, and that means that each one of these NASA Surveyor missions cost the American taxpayers $600 million. And incidentally, the entire CLPS program that NASA got approved through Congress, and the budget for that program runs $2.6 billion, which means that the budget that NASA got for CLPS would barely pay for 4 of the old Surveyor spacecraft. 4. And NASA has already launched 4 vehicles under CLPS, and they have a lot more to go. Let's go ahead and compare some of these costs. First of all, the Peregrine 1 from Astrobotic. Obviously a complete failure, but at the same time only ran $108 million. And incidentally, Astrobotic made a Herculean effort to salvage this vehicle and got some performance out of it, and probably could have made it at least to lunar orbit had NASA allowed them to, but NASA, for reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, compelled them to crash it into the atmosphere. If you're interested as to why, I've got a video linked at the end of this one. So the IM-1 mission, which once again, partially successful, $118 million. Then you have Blue Ghost, the 100% successful mission from Firefly, also being the least expensive out of the 4 at $101.5 million, and IM-2 being $102 million or so. And if you're keeping track, that's approximately $420 million or $180 million less than a cost of a single NASA Surveyor mission back in the 1960s. And the prices just keep getting better as time goes on. The Griffin being launched by Astrobotic, by the way, that's going to be riding a Falcon Heavy, an incredible incredibly ambitious mission based on the payload involved $320.4 million, half the price of a Surveyor, in spite of the fact that this thing is a monster, much larger than any of the Surveyor robots were. We'll get to that one in just a bit. Now, IM-3 from Intuitive Machines, hopefully their chance to make a comeback, $77.5 million for that one, so getting even less expensive with the more missions that they send out. Then you have the Series 2 lander from Draper, the first effort from Draper at $73 million, and then Firefly's second Blue Ghost mission at $130 million. And so what you're looking at here is 8 missions, more than the NASA Surveyor program had, for less than $950 million. And by the way, that's less than half of the total budget that's been allotted for CLPS, meaning that we probably have at least another 8 missions, if not more, coming before the program ends in 2028. So you're looking at 16 missions at least for $2 billion less than NASA spent for 7 robotic missions back in the 1960s. And that is the philosophy that NASA has been working under for quite some time now, trying to accomplish more with less. And sometimes these sorts of missions fail. These companies are trying to make a profit off of a razor-thin budget, and sometimes you just can't get the same kind of reliability as NASA used to get with $600 million a mission. And by the way, SpaceX has made all of this possible. Even though obviously these companies have been working under very small budgets, the price tags that we've been talking about would have been completely unattainable back in the days of the Atlas Centaur. Even the Astrobotic mission, which flew on a Vulcan Centaur for $108 million, well, that price tag was made possible because ULA was offering an extremely cut rate price for their first ever Vulcan Centaur launch. And it was a good gamble as far as Astrobotic was concerned. Vulcan delivered the payload appropriately, but unfortunately, the lander's propulsion system failed afterwards. But without a $60 million per launch price tag, which is only possible through SpaceX, none of these things could have happened at all. And once again, if you're using Falcon 9 and reusability, therefore not burning up all of your propellant, going into as high of an orbit as possible before stage separation, then a quick journey from the Earth to the Moon is no longer possible. A 3-day time frame is simply unachievable with a Falcon 9. A Falcon Heavy could be a little bit different, especially if you expend the core stage. Don't reuse that, but instead use it to drive the payload into as high of an orbit as possible before you have stage separation. But overall, reusability means longer time frames for interplanetary destinations or from Earth to Moon missions. No way around that, but overall, it shouldn't have a very big impact on robotic missions. And by the way, that's also the reason that Starship requires all of that low Earth orbit refueling. So much of Starship's propellant has to be kept in reserve to land the booster back at the launch site, and also you have to shut down the booster's engines much earlier in the flight than you would with an expendable rocket. So the entire process changes a lot, and that's something we've been seeing with these early missions. Nevertheless, has the media been talking about this at all? Has the media been explaining all of the positive things that CLPS has been bringing to the Artemis program? Because yes, there have been some failures, but still, NASA has been getting far more bang for their buck overall off of that Firefly mission alone than NASA ever got out of Surveyor, especially when you consider that 2 Surveyor missions were lost completely at a price tag of $1.2 billion to the taxpayers. And while the mainstream media, and honestly myself as well, have been talking endlessly about IM-2 toppling over and about Starship's failures, they have failed to mention the following at all. On March the 2nd, 2025, Blue Ghost deployed its X-band antenna, which allowed it to more rapidly downlink high-definition imagery and videos and to transmit payload science data back to Earth. And once this was done, things started changing dramatically. By March 4th, Firefly had downloaded 57 gigs worth of data, far more than Surveyor ever could have done in the old days, and operations also included deploying something called the Lunar Planet Vac, which allowed them to sample lunar regolith, deploying the electrodynamic dust shield and demonstrating dust mitigation, and capturing images of lunar regolith from the SCALPS instrument during descent, which, by the way, studies the plume of debris that gets kicked up by a spacecraft's engines when landing on the moon. Very important to avoid damage when more powerful spacecraft begin to land. In addition to that, the Italian Lugre system tracked global navigation satellite signals on the moon's surface for the first time ever, making navigation on the moon far more effective and far easier to implement in the future. Very good news and a very successful mission for this particular piece of equipment. And the list goes on and on. 8 out of 10 NASA payloads have already completely finished their missions by March 6th of 2025. And right now, given how temperatures are increasing during the middle of the lunar day, you think that space is cold all the time. It isn't. The hottest part of the lunar day can get up to 121 degrees Celsius. So right now, Blue Ghost has begun planned power cycling to keep the lander as cool as possible. And with the 8 payloads objectives already complete, Firefly is close to achieving complete success. And then we have the next Astrobotic mission coming up towards the end of 2025 after an inauspicious start. And then after NASA canceling the Viper mission, the media would have everyone believe that Griffin had no purpose anymore, that all of this was a completely wasted effort, and Griffin would just be delivering a dummy payload to the moon's surface with nothing being gained out of the mission. This is not true at all, and once again, this has not been made public in the media much at all, but a very important payload has now replaced Viper. Astrobotic was still getting the same money for the mission that they were always getting, so they were offering extremely discounted prices to anybody who wanted a ride to the moon. And Astrolab, which is working on a lunar rover for astronauts, by the way, one of my favorite designs for a lunar rover, well, they also have a cargo rover called Flip. And by the way, I got an opportunity to see Flip in person during the IAC convention in Milan. See, there I am. In any event, if you're interested in that rover and everything it can do, well, I have another video linked at the end of this one that covered that particular rollout event. But Astrolab saw the opportunity of using Griffin because rovers are big, heavy vehicles, definitely required some sort of resilient and robust lunar lander to carry it all the way to the lunar surface, and so they decided to take the payload space away from NASA. And Flip is going to be able to carry out some very important objectives for NASA in the future. The ability to carry cargo from one place to another on the lunar surface will be absolutely essential if NASA wants to maintain a permanent presence there. And in addition, Astrobotic also has a Cube rover on this mission, and the LandCam X payload from the European Space Agency, together with a laser retroreflector array from NASA. Would we prefer to see the Viper rover return to service? Well, absolutely, but Astrobotic isn't just building one Griffin. They have another one in the works that could definitely do the job if Viper ever comes back, which NASA should definitely do sometime in the near future. So the bottom line is there's a lot of positive things to talk about in regards to American spaceflight right now. A lot of accomplishments by NASA, by these private companies, especially Firefly, but all of them have accomplished at least something on the moon. And although Astrobotic has yet to get to the moon, I think that the squat, wide landing gear design of Griffin, just like the Firefly Blue Ghost had a wide landing gear, is going to serve it very well. And if it can make it to a landing configuration, I'm pretty certain that it will have a successful mission to the lunar surface as well. I think that Intuitive Machines has some work to do on their landing design, some way to increase the span of their landing gear a bit. I think that that lander is a bit top heavy given the fact that it's flipped over twice now, but really overall, I think that this has been a very positive year for spaceflight thus far. And if the NASA engineers of the 1960s had been saddled with the shoestring budgets that NASA has today, I have my doubts as to whether or not they would have been as successful as the NASA engineers of today have been with the CLPS missions thus far. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon and PayPal. I'm going to be making a journey to yet another conference, this one next month in Colorado Springs, the Space Symposium, the biggest space conference in the United States. Everybody who is anybody is going to be at this conference. I've been there a couple of times and I have been invited once again, which is a huge thing. It usually costs over $1,000 to go to this thing. I get to go for free as a journalist. All I need to do is pay for my airfare. It's not very expensive, but still, flying from London, it's not exactly cheap either. And also, as far as the merchandise contest is concerned, the UFO guys still have a very solid lead, but now the spaceflight folks, the Hohmann orbital equation folks, they're in second place, but the Apophis folks are hot on their heels. And remember, at this point, I'm going to do 2 space-related weeks, depending on who wins out. Probably right now, looks like there's going to be a UFO week, followed by a spaceflight week, but that could change. Don't forget to check out the merchandise. It's awesome stuff. Everything's in the description, folks. So until next time, stay angry about space.